With infinite complaisance, people went to and fro of the earth about their little affairs, serene in the assurance of their dominion over this small, spinning fragment of solar driftwood, which by chance or design, man has inherited out of the dark mystery of time and space.
So on this edition of Into the Fray, I am very excited to bring on two former ITF guests. I have on with me Chuck from episode 194, that would be the Peace Officer and the Cryptids of Flint River, and James P. Akin, of course he goes by Pat, and he was on episode 275, which was entitled Elkins Creek. Now, if you guys did not listen to either one of those episodes, you wouldn't probably know why they would be on the same show together. But that is because they are in the same area, and there is a lot of weird stuff going on in Georgia. So I brought them both back on for a kind of a roundtable situation, and something that I'm going to have each one of them do is just a quick snapshot of their background, why we're on here, why we're talking about Bigfoot and cryptids and all sorts of other strange goodies in the Georgia area, and probably their area most specifically. And another very important thing to note, these are not two just random guys, which would be fine, except that they also happen to be, both of them, prior law enforcement. So highly trained individuals, and have seen some very odd things that they have shared. Again, the details will be mostly there for you guys to go back and consume on 194 and 275. You're going to hear some of that today, of course, because it's valid as we move through this roundtable talk. But I mean, who would like to go first? Chuck, how about you? Let's just get a snapshot of why you're here. You know, why are we even talking about cryptids or Bigfoot or maybe even Dogman? What's the deal? Why are you here?
Well, I said in episode 194, I never believed in any of this until that one night of my first incident where I helped the young lady out. And then it wasn't too much of a time frame after that where I had a second incident. And all of this is along the Flint River corridor that flows through, you know, these 3 or 4 counties right here that are real close to both of us. You know, with that, when things like that happen and you actually see and have tangible evidence and, you know, more than one witness with you, I've got no choice to believe in what I saw. But as far as what it is, I'm still torn. I've got several theories about it, and we can just, you know, we'll discuss that later, and I discuss it a little bit in episode 194. But Pat's information ties in to the same area, and it is a lot like mine, and you know, and I'll let him explain his side of it. But for me, it's just kind of clearing my, I don't know, it's just kind of getting it out there, but not to the extent that I'm trying to. It's definitely not trying to profit, but not trying to browbeat anybody and say, "Oh, this is real." I don't care if they believe me or not, because at times I still struggle with what I saw. I don't know if that makes sense, but I struggle. I don't struggle with the reality portion of it. I struggle with what it was.
I think I can identify with Chuck in that. You know, this happened, and it is cathartic. That's what Elkins Creek was about, was getting it out of me, outside of me, and perhaps owning this incident because, prior to this, and I still am to a very large degree, very analytical. And I was a science person. But what I discovered on the heels of my incident with taking the cast and things that have subsequently happened was that there's more to heaven and earth than is dreamt of in our philosophy, as the Shakespeare quote goes. And, as I listened to Chuck's episode, and all of the things that he talked about, I could identify with from the perspective of having been in law enforcement and dealing with these issues. And, the fact that he's talking about the area that I was resident, in and working in as a police officer. So I just think really, we're going to explore today some things that are, they're just off the beaten path for most people, because most people don't really want to know about this sort of thing. And, it's just something that, let's just be honest. I mean, I went through a couple of years of nightmares, and even to this day, I'll find myself in my mind's eye in that creek looking around, because it touched something inside of me that's pretty deep, and something that was unexplainable inside my own psyche, inside my own person. And what do? It's like post-traumatic stress disorder. It's like, you've got to deal with this. You've got to deal with what's going on. And really, that's why I'm here, is because I wanted to, after you had talked about the roundtable, I said, well, sure, I'd love to participate and hear what he has to say and what you have to say. Because if we don't discuss these things, then how will we learn from whatever we're supposed to be learning from them, I guess, is my total sort of idea as a person and as an investigator into this sort of phenomenon. So that's kind of me in a nutshell there.
Well, and if I may, Pat, because something that I jotted down, because I re-listened to both of your episodes just to be sure I was up on everything. And then you brought up the nightmares, and that is something that you both unequivocally were like, this is what's going on. I'm waking up in the cold sweat. I'm back there. I'm terrified. And Chuck said the exact same thing in his episode, that he has nightmares about his, these things being out there, what they can do. What in the world are they? I think is the biggest question. But that's a striking similarity that you guys have both gone through or are still going through.
Yeah, to this day, the thing that gets me the most is I haven't had it in I guess several weeks, but I remember the last time I did, it was about 4:00 in the morning, and I mean, I woke up hearing those footsteps again, and just, my heart's beating out of my chest. Which my incident is a little more involved than Pat's. I mean, I was all but attacked. I mean, I still feel like I was stalked and sized up to as prey. But yeah, that still stays with me to this day.
It's intermittent for me now. Maybe once, twice a year, and I've found that it directly relates to the level of stress going on in my life, seemingly, which is why I make the comparison to PTSD. But no, the realness of it never goes away. And, back when it initially happened, I would have what I'd call a waking nightmare. It's like I would daydream, and I would recount or go back through the incident. And it's just that one thing. It's this fight or flight thing. I'm in the creek, I'm looking around, and I feel like I'm in mortal danger. And it's just that episode that seems to just, almost like a tape loop in my mind. But, fortunately, like I said, that's abated some. And because I really do feel like I have wrapped my brain a little bit better around the possibility of these things existing. Because I'll just tell you the truth, and I've heard it from people all over who have been involved in this. Some real old time guys who I've contacted, and, But they all say that, you're going to you go through what they call the reality shift. That when you initially encounter this stuff, it changes your worldview. And what you thought was a bunch of junk, some Hollywood scary movie, that sort of stuff. But then you encounter this, and suddenly it's no longer the realm of imaginary. It has translated into reality for you. And I think every person, I don't care who they are, once this happens to you, you're going to see the world in a much different way than you did before. Like I said, it's really, truly expanded and deepened my religious belief, much more so than it was prior to the incident. So, I just think it comes with its territory, be honest.
Right. And to be clear, everybody, we are not just talking about Bigfoot, and I was kind of hinting that in the intro. That's why it's the cryptids of Flint River. And as far as Chuck goes specifically, that second incident, he admits he didn't know what that was. To him, though, it wasn't a Bigfoot. He says it was something else. The closest thing it seems like he could liken it to, pun intended, I guess, I'm so funny, was a werewolf of some sort, right? So, and that's what we're dealing with here, is that, well, number one, we don't know what we're dealing with, and number two, it just seems like there's all kinds of things out there around you guys that, and of course, Pat, you're coming at this from, they're not always there. And they're actually not even really ever really truly here. They don't even live here. They're not from here. That's a whole nother subject that we will get into. I guess the roundabout way I'm trying to get at this is just to be clear that we are not just talking about Bigfoot. And the cast, the Elkins Creek cast that Pat was able to execute, it's an astonishing cast, by the way. You guys can go to intothefrayradio.com and head right to 275, or just type in Elkins Creek cast, hit images, it'll pop right up. And the detail on that thing is incredible. It actually got sent out to not only, one of the four horsemen of Bigfoot, Grover Krantz, but also Dr. Jeff Meldrum. And he said, what did he say? He's like, yeah, this is concurrent with what we are seeing. We've got thermal ridges. We've got all these things going on. And so at least for that amount of time, that Bigfoot was there, right? So, Chuck, in that first incident with the young lady, something that came up for both of the incidents was obviously because you discharged your weapon, which is a big deal for you guys as law enforcement officers. It was highly aggressive. And in the first incident, it was also highly aggressive. So, the thinking on your side, I'm assuming still to this day, is that either one of those was indeed a Bigfoot. Not impossible for a Bigfoot to be a little pissy, of course, but it just seemed for that girl to be going through what she was going through. It was like a scene out of a horror movie. She's running and screaming towards you going, it's after me. You don't really hear that a whole lot in Bigfoot tales.
With the handprints and her as scared as she was, and then the smell. I've recently gotten back in touch with Dwight. And he had a very good description of the smell. And just like mine, he said it smelled like skunk, but we used to run trap lines. And he said, think about how the iron and steel smells on a trap. He said, it's almost like dry blood. He said it was like that metallic iron smell and skunk mixed together. And that's the perfect, that's the best way that I know that it's been described, was the smell that I smelled. So, but the first one was, there was tangible evidence of an extremely strong being, whatever it was. I just don't know how else to describe it.
Something that I didn't dive into, and just like you guys said, like you, Pat, you're like, oh, all this outline, is easy to put forth, because once you get off the call or the interview, you're like, oh, I should have said this and that and brought up this and that. when I was listening back to me interviewing you the first time on 194, you said that the handprint that was left on the girl had 3 digits and a thumb. And I never went back to that or asked you more about that or what in the world you thought about that, because that was very strange.
You know, it was clearly 3 fingers. I mean, just like my hand, if I were to look at it, it would have been missing the pinky. I don't know, you know, pinky tends to be the weakest finger on your hand, so maybe his grip was the first 3 fingers, and the thumb, or its grip, was the first 3 fingers, and the thumb, it could have been missing. I don't want to speculate too much on that. I've given that some thought, but without trying to dive in and be too presumptuous or whatever the correct word is the bruising, the actual seeing the bruising and seeing the formation. Because in law enforcement, I've seen slap bruising, I've seen grip bruising, and I have seen pictures of grip bruising that you could clearly define 2 or 3 fingers, but you can always define that thumb, that opposing digit. So it's not impossible for the pinky to not have left a bruise.
Right. That's true. Yeah, so we're not talking about some lizard man or something. It's just probably wasn't strong enough to leave the mark. Right. Okay. Why don't we touch on staying with kind of the smell of things, right? And this is something, Pat, you sent in the notes, and it has been talked about plenty on Chuck's episode and other Bigfoot episodes with other folks. But you've got rotting flesh, and it smells like I said, occasionally I'll get the ozone, like you mentioned, Pat. Rotting flesh, you've got the wet dog, you've got garbage, all kinds of things come up with this stuff. So as far as, and Pat, I don't know if you wanted to jump in with this first, the smell aspect of it seems to have not only a different effect on people, a lasting effect. The olfactory senses can be one of the strongest things tied to memory, of course. But, you know, as we postulated in your episode, the whole ozone thing had a strange timing situation to it, right? So the coming and the going, but then in the notes that you sent as far as, you know, these thoughts that maybe we should touch on was the whole, the demonic thing tied with rotting flesh. I'm looking at it right here. You said rotting flesh, decomposition, and sulfur, and red eyes, and the feelings of dread, which of course you did have that initially when you went down there into Elkins Creek, and it was gone by the time you came back, but the ozone smell was there. So maybe we could just kind of open up a little discussion on that side of things, since you both did have some kind of an interaction with the smell side of this phenomenon.
Well, I think that in listening to Chuck's episode, I think the first thing that struck me was that, and perhaps this is because of, you know, where we're raised at, but church is pretty prevalent around, and we were like, you know, I was like, his first inclination is something demonic. And, you know, I had that thought in the time since my incident. You know, I started just kind of correlating and putting things together, and all of these facts seem to come with someone who's had a demonic episode as well. Now, I'm not saying it's necessarily demonic in origin, but I'm just saying, you're looking at the bigger picture. Why do we always have this smell? Why do we always have these feelings, etc.? Now, in my case, he describes elements that I think I remember myself, but I mean, I just remember a very rotting, strong urine, kind of a hog pen sort of smell to the area where I was doing the investigation, you know. And I've never been able to account for the ozone smell, because it wasn't, like I said, I've thought about it since you and I spoke, and I just really, at the time, I don't remember. I remember it being prevalent on my return to make the cast, but not at the time, although I did suffer the feelings of dread. Certainly, really, I mean, terror is the best. It's fight or flight. It was a lot more flight, I think, than fight. That has stuck with me all these years, you know. So I don't know, but we know, I mean, in a general sense, that every time you encounter one of these things, that you encounter these awful smells and these feelings. And I don't know, I've heard people postulate that this is interference with electromagnetic spectrum from ghost hunting. They say, well, you get these feelings if the EMF is too high in an area. And I don't know, just having explored, I wonder sometimes now, I don't know what these things are. Do they possess mass? Well, yeah, they possess mass because I have a cast. I know something stepped there. But as to, you know, what is it? What is it composed of? Do I think it's an ape? Not really. No, I don't think it's an ape in the sense that Jane Goodall is going to go out and camp in the Flint River Basin, you know, live among the Bigfoot and write a journal about it. I just don't buy that anymore. And I don't know what we're dealing with. The whole area itself has a history of strangeness. And, you know, I can only say, you know, everything that he said in his episode was very familiar. The feelings and everything. Now, I don't know about the Dogman situation, although, you know, I'm not doubting him. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying for that. I'm just saying I haven't encountered that, although I have encountered footprints that were pretty odd that, you know, in thinking about it, could have been something like that up around the WMA. So I don't know what we're dealing with in the sense of what the smell is, but I do know that the smell seems to preface you encountering one of these things. And another thing he spoke about, Chuck did, was the absolute silence. Because I remember that it would just go absolutely silent. In fact, the old man told me that he knew it was coming, or he knew it was an area because everything would stop. The crickets, the birds, everything would go absolutely silent. And at the time, you know, I'm out there trying to clear a call, but in hindsight, which is, you know, 2020, I do remember how quiet it was, considering proximity to water with the frogs and the peepers and those things. So I don't know. I just really honestly think that the area has something going on in and of itself. And I can't prove anything, but I'm just a guy, you know, I'm not out to prove anything. I just think that Chuck he's just got his chapter, his episode in his life of encountering the same sorts of things that I encountered maybe, I think, probably almost a decade earlier. And it's just still there. I'm not even certain, really, if to a certain degree, if it's conscious of us in a way. But, you know, that's me spitballing.
With you talking about mass, I know my second incident, whatever it was, I know it had mass. I'm very confident that it was shot twice. Mm-hmm. And I say that because I know on one round that I fired, I heard it, and it wasn't a scream or a yelp. It wasn't you hear the muffled Hollywood type deal or the super amplified squeals of a dying werewolf on The Howling or whatever. It wasn't like that. It's so hard to describe. I don't even want to try to describe it. But knowing what I heard, and then the second shot was with a higher powered rifle. It was a little bit different, but it was obvious it was hit. And so I know the mass is there, whether it's demonic or not. I don't feel like if that incident were demonic, I don't feel like a bullet would have hurt it. I think it would have been a different scenario. We probably wouldn't have gotten that far. And I go back to that one, and I feel like I was sized up to the point where if I didn't want to leave, it made me leave either way. I hate to say kill me because I'm not going down without a fight, but it was obvious on every incident on that farm that people were not welcome.
And, and I think that's the thing, that has astounded me over the years is, I went through the whole thing after my initial incident. And then, once the footprint came back and they had verified that, no, this is like what we got out here in the Pacific Northwest. I did the whole, I guess you'd call it a newbie sort of thing. I started investigating this and looking into it, and me and several friends. And, the thing that just really struck me was the absolute, except for 2 instances, absence of activity. We had one camp out where I felt like something came through the camp, and a friend of mine saw what he felt like was a head and shoulders through, we're going back so far that it was a starlight scope. And he was prepared. I mean, he had his 375 Holland and Holland out there. And we were under the assumption that this was a purely flesh and blood creature. So, over time that changed. And then I had my incident up there in the ring of trees where the track path just basically disappeared. And that really, again, it was another situation where it altered my perception of what we might be dealing with. So, I don't doubt at all when you say that you hit something,
Right.
But what in the world did you hit? See, and that's the thing that's always perplexed me out of this is because I know I'm from here. I know what a 308 will do. I've seen myriad over my career gunshot wounds. I've seen more people killed with a 25 than anything that knock a size of a saucer out of something's back, which is what a 308 would do to a man size or even a larger man size creature. People don't realize until they're exposed to this the absolute destruction that'll be caused from a high velocity rifle round, especially something like a 308 or 300 Win Mag, which was always my choice out there. And what was it, that it got up, that this thing walked away? And I've heard this from people on the West Coast. They've popped it with a 30-30. And people, well, a 30-30 is a small round. Well, not if you've been hit by a 30-30. It's not a small round.
Right.
I don't care if you're the size of a Brahma bull. You get popped in the shoulder or in the chest with a 30-30, you're going to hopefully go to the Bigfoot emergency room if you can survive to get there.
The girl in the first instance, for her to have tangible damage to, her vehicle was knocked off the jack. There was dents, and the seat was busted, and it was, I think it was angry that she got away.
I believe that.
I don't know. It seems like it just, in my limited, I don't research this stuff. I don't go looking for it. I don't have a problem talking about my experience, but I'm not going to go looking for somebody else's experience out of self-preservation. And, but for her to have tangible, evidence on her body and on her vehicle, as visibly shaken as she was, and she told me it was not a man. She didn't know what it was. So demonic possession. It's leaving footprints. It's leaving. It was obviously anger, but it seems like women have the more severe reactions to them than men. And I don't know what your thought it may be on that. Why women? Is it looking to procreate or what?
I don't know. I will say this: historically, we have to understand that our perception of the demonic world has been framed over the last 2 centuries in the United States where there's been a constant barrage from science to negate the possibility or the existence of demons. Okay. But if we went back several hundred years or even 1,000, it was not uncommon for people to know, believe, to document that the demonic could have tangible mass and exist in a real way. Now, this is not negating the fact that in the Bible or any other place that, you know, demons aren't a spirit, which they are. But leaping forward back to what you're talking about with her, your victim in the first incident, I always felt that ultimately that the old couple were being preyed upon, and I mean that in the strictest sense of the word, that had the old man been stupid enough to exit outside and confront this thing, he would have been a missing person. I've just seen this over the years after having reading just scads about this and talking to people, that it seems like they do, or if we're talking about Bigfoot or whatever these things are, they do tend to follow along the lines of snatching older individuals, women, kids, weaker individuals. Not that women are weak, by the way. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that someone smaller in stature, something that like the cheetah or the lion on the African plain would select one that he was pretty positive he could take, is what I'm trying to say by that. So does it fit a pattern? Yes, I feel like that your incidents fit a pattern. You also said that you were told to leave. Okay, well, I was never told this, but in the secondhand way, the old gentleman reported to me that it was mocking the way he called their dog. They had a little Chihuahua, Peanut, and it would outside the window, you know, and would in a real low voice basically extend the vowels out and go Peanut. You know, I can't do it as low because he said it would vibrate your chest. So I see a pattern. I see that emerge in the general area. So I think that, you know, you're on to something. I think that your incidents are valid. I mean, I think it takes bravery on your part to come out and to say, okay, you know, I this is what I've experienced. And you also, you kind of validated and affirmed me in that you were sharing that nobody wants to deal with it, more especially at an administrative or an official level. If a report, see, there's no, you know, people don't get it. A lot of people that are listening, they're living in a very urban or metropolitan area. Everything's computerized, but in those days, even as late as a decade later, everything was done on paper. So if you wrote the thing down and you turned the report in, it'd have to go through two people before it was ever filed. And you know, even if you got a case number, and most of these wouldn't have qualified as a full incident report. They would have all been a prowler call, which we called at the time, it was a code 4, I think is what it was called, which is basically just a contact card, which you fill out and say, okay, I went to such and such place and this is what happened. And we're talking about a paragraph. So everything you're saying to me rings, it's so familiar. It's just so true. And, you know, that's always, it continues to be my question is, you know, okay, if you can prove to me that there's a tribe of cavemen, essentially, some kind of, you know, remnant hominid that has survived from the Pleistocene and is living along the Flint River, okay, I'll eat my hat, you know, I'll bow right out and go on down the road. Thank you. You've solved the mystery. I'll go on with my life. But time after time, as we look at the evidence, as we investigate these things, as we talk about them, there's always these gaping holes in that theory or hypothesis.
Well, you know as well as I do the county we're talking about. I mean, even a decade after you, 2003, 2004, we're talking about a department that only had one computer to do reports between all 4 shifts.
That's right.
You know, so you know, we did stat 4 cards and turned them in, and those weren't even entered into the computer. You did a accident report by hand. You did your incident reports, which is your Stat 5, Code 5. You did those because that was probably something that was going to have to go to court.
Mm-hmm.
And then, in 2003, most homes, most homes either had a computer or had access to one. And we're talking about an apartment that would only furnish one computer for, I don't even remember how many of us there were, but so in that county, and you experienced it yourself, hey, that we need to keep that quiet. This is what you did. This is what you saw. Mm-hmm. You experienced the same thing I did. So, which tells me that either certain sections of people know, or certain people in certain authoritative positions know, but for lack of wanting the attention, or positive or negative, that people are told, because I had more than one deputy tell me, this is what, I wouldn't write it up as that. This is what you saw, because this is liable to happen. And it happened, which is totally against everything I was taught in state training.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, but it's like I said, you validate so much in your episode that I listened to, because off of the air, when we initially spoke, we were talking about the area where that incident took place. And on the heels of my incident, probably a month or two later, I reported to you that, okay, there was another sighting of something crossing the road out there, but I was never able to follow up or find out about it. Okay, this is the exact same area. It is the exact same area. I don't care that it's a decade apart, but in the same area, which, by the way, is a spooky, backwards area. If in my day, it was a place where people, they would dump stolen cars and burn them and that sort of thing. It was way back off near the river. And, it just tells me in the fact that you're saying, no, if you write this up as a person riding a horse. Okay, well, that makes sense to me too, because, considering the size of the cast, it would be approximately 8-9 feet off of the ground. The top of the head would, if you were standing flat-footed and looking at this thing from a distance, and it would be about like someone sitting on a horse. So, all of these elements, they just, I don't know, they're meshing so well today that, we're talking about this, and I don't know, it helps me. It makes me feel like I'm not so crazy after all, that, there's more than me. Lots of other people have encountered this. And as an aside, we were talking about a little town on the other side of the river. It's off 74 there. And I was visiting my brother. He was there for a little while. I went to the grocery store. There's only one grocery store there, but it's a pretty good grocery store, and they have lamb, and I like lamb, and it's one of the few places around here where you can get decent cuts of lamb. But anyway, I was over there, so I said, I'm going to stop in. Went in, I picked up a couple of things, and I was standing behind two gentlemen who, from their conversation, because I didn't interrupt them and I didn't bring attention to it. I'm like you in that regard. I'm not out advertising who I am or whatever, but they were talking about something was stealing their livestock. Okay. And they, from their description, this is 2 years ago now. Something's easing in getting chickens. Something has opened a rabbit hutch. Well, I don't know about you, but I've seen lots of possums and foxes and different things over the years, but I've never seen one able to lift a latch on a closed rabbit hutch.
Right. A fox will chew through the wire.
That's right. He's going to go through the wire. They're going to find an alternate way, but they're not going to open the door. Right. And the way this guy, there's just two old farmers, and I was just standing behind them. That place has like a little deli in it.
I know exactly where you're talking about.
You know where I'm talking about. And they were getting something. I'm pretty positive they were getting something for lunch, or they were coming back because it was during the week. And they were just, they were checking out and they were talking. And I just listened to them, listened to what they said. And, I said, well, this is what that put it 2018 or something, 2019, right around that time frame. And I said, here we're going on 20 plus years and there's still stuff. There's still stuff happening over here. There's still stuff going on.
Well, even at that bridge, that community, we were talking about used to be the diner juke joint deal.
That's right.
You go over in that community. I used to know people over there and worked with a couple of those guys. And before law enforcement, I was a very young man at that time. And some of the tales that used to get passed around when we'd be over there sitting around a fire drinking beer and I'm picking guitars, and some of the stuff that was told, and like I said, at that time in my life, I would not have believed it unless I could put my hands on it or, see it or what. And I'm still that way. People are going to question me, well, you said you believe in the Bible wholeheartedly. The Dead Sea Scrolls proved it. I mean, and that's all I'm going to say. But when it comes to something lifting and opening latches and versus your typical raccoon or fox or possum that'll chew through a wire, that's an intelligence. And I fully believe that they're intelligent enough to recognize, a game camera. They may see a different color spectrum. I don't know. I mean, I know deer see a different color spectrum. So they could see a spectrum that allows them to see these things. Oh, that's a game camera on a tree. We'll just walk this way. Before
we get into the kind of what Pat's saying about the possible paranormal side of this whole thing, Pat, would you mind sharing what you said? There was 2 instances while you were still with, head of the Georgia Swamp Ape Research Center. Would you mind going over what that other instance was? You saw the thing around the camp, or your friend did. What was the other instance that you guys had happen?
Well, I was talking about the first was the track path that just started and went off into the water. That was the first time.
Okay.
That was that. And then later on by myself was when I found the track path ended in the ring of trees and just disappeared. And that again, that stopped me essentially from going in the woods by myself like that. I quit after that. And, and I think rightly and smartly so, because I've never been able to logically give an explanation as to why or how those tracks ended. Now, the one in the camp, we had gone out there, and understand that this is still at the height and the heat of this when we thought that, this is some kind of remnant sort of hominid, some kind of creature that I felt might be some sort of surviving ape man or something. But that day, I mean, we basically, this was very early in the morning, and I don't know, it's like I just remember him saying to me, and I had fallen sort of halfway asleep and got really like upset and scared, almost like I was having a nightmare. But the next day he had built a blind and was positioned away from where we were off this promontory. And he swore up and down, he said he saw what appeared to be the large shoulders and the head. He described it as being almost bullet-shaped, a bullet-shaped sort of head, and said he kept it in his starlight scope for a while, and said that, I forgot exactly what drew his attention, but he blinked, he moved his eyes, come back, and he was never able to find the silhouette again. And, I can't say we never saw anything in the camp where something had gone through, although everybody there had the impression that something had come through the camp. Wasn't any alcohol or any illegal drugs, or none of that's taking place, I mean, coffee. We did have some coffee out there that night. I don't know. We're going back. That's probably the interesting thing is that's probably around 99 or 2000 when those incidents took place. we can't, I don't know, you know, the whole area, going back to Chuck's instant where he's talking about the dog man. You know, I would go out in the intervening time between there and say 2012 or that time frame. I'd go out and I'd scout and I'd walk and I'd look and I'd go up to that WMA, especially because it was easier access to get down to the river, because I was always looking for footprints in mud after that. You know, I would look for places along the bank of the river where something could enter, leave, you know, deer crossing, whatever you want to call it. That's where I saw the strange footprint, although I was never able at the time to make heads or tails of that. And it looked like essentially a big dog paw with a long, narrow heel attached to it. But at the time, I thought perhaps the dog was like sitting up, maybe, you know how they can sit on their haunches, or it had leapt off or something, but it didn't make any sense to me at the time. And I just basically filed that away as being canid in origin. But after what you said, after what Chuck said, I mean, I was just like, well, maybe I did see something that day and I just, you know, wasn't aware of it.
You know, I've never seen a track. I didn't go back to that property where that happened at. And I say that after the day that we went back and we were told we had to get our stuff and leave. That was the only time, but we didn't get to go to that actual location. I mean, because that was my goal that next morning, was to go back and recover an animal or something. I don't, Shannon, if it's okay, I can give some detail as to some other stuff that led up to that.
Absolutely.
I've recently, after 194, episode 194, I made it an extremely hard effort to reconnect with Dwight. We reconnected, and it's like old times. Dwight's going to be listening to this episode, so I want to do him justice. But I talked to Dwight this morning. One of his children was hunting with him once down there, and it was same season. He said he was sitting there just about asleep. He said it was so quiet, peaceful, and it was in the afternoon. And he said that his daughter just started bumping his leg, you know, real quick, get his attention, wake him up. And she told him, said, that's a bear. He said, nah, ain't no bear. You know, I said, I don't know, I guess it could be. You know, we're right here on a creek that feeds into the Flint River. And he said, I guess it could be. He said she wouldn't go back. She was scared. She says after she became an adult and after hearing, you know, what happened to me and him that night, she told me, that's what I saw. It was the same thing. I wish I could remember exactly how she put it, and I don't even want to try to do that because I'll misstate it. But there was another incident on the same farm where a friend of mine and Dwight's, I'm not even going to give him a name. They were walking across the field, one of the open fields, and there's a feeder bell ring. Dwight told me they used to sit with their backs up against that bell ring, and they would look back up to a corner where there was pines that were sparsely planted. They had some of them, for some reason, some of the pines had died out, and the deer the few deer that would come out right there would feed out onto the edge and walk up toward the road, and they would cross the road, and you could get a shot at them. So our friend turned around and was standing there for a minute, and they were deciding whether or not to sit there or not. Dwight said he raised the friend raised his rifle up and was looking through the scope. And he said, "Man, I see something over there." He said, "Well, is it a deer?" He said he looked back through his scope. He said, "No, man, we got to go." He said, "I don't know what that is." And he said he tried to look again and couldn't find anything. And he refused. And Dwight's talked to him since, you know, in between that time that I was able to reconnect to him. and he refuses to put a label on it. So he never went back hunting down there. And see, my time down there was less hunting and more helping. So I didn't get to hunt a whole lot. I don't know. I still don't know demonic, flesh and blood. It's just one of those issues that I can't come to a solid label with, and don't know if I ever will.
Yeah, and if again, I'll encourage everybody to go back and check out 194 because Dwight was a huge part, obviously, of that second incident in which you actually discharged your weapon. Did Dwight say anything else about that incident to you when you spoke to him today?
So Dwight and I we were talking about where our friend had seen that across the field, and talking to him, he said, "Man, he said, that when he looks back on things, that there was so many odd instances of like what I had, where things would just go definitely quiet." And he said he had it happen to him in the morning, but it would be very early, because Dwight wasn't like me. I don't get into a deer stand an hour and a half before daylight. And he will. He'll go in an hour and a half before daylight, take him a nap, and it's always quiet before dawn, but you always hear something. He said, "Man," he said, he never experienced a quiet like that. And this is Dwight telling, because Dwight don't want to be on the show, but he did bless me, give me his permission to tell a few things that had happened to him without me down there. So the family member that got us permission to go over there and hunt that place, his younger brother met Dwight out there, and they went hunting, and Dwight put him in one of his ladder stands. And I know the stand where he was at. It was on the side of a sloping hill overlooking a hardwood bottom, beautiful, clean ground on the area. And the boy said he was sitting there. He said, just as it was getting, the sun was going, he said, the sun was going behind the trees, and you couldn't see the sun, but it was still plenty of light to see. Dwight told me that the boy called him on the radio. I'm sorry, I'm laughing. He said the boy called him on the radio and said, "Man, you got to come get me." He said, "Something's throwing sticks at me." And Dwight called him back and said, "What?" And he said, "You're in a tree." He said, "Yeah, and something's throwing big sticks at me." Well, the boy, I want to say he was 16 at the time, 16 or 17. And he said he was sitting there. He said a limb the size of his forearm flew at him from the ground and went over his head, hit the tree behind him, and busted to pieces. That didn't fall. I mean, and he clearly said, I asked Dwight, he said it clearly came from the ground, not bouncing around. But the boy never said he saw, he never said he could see what it was or anything like that. So just weird stuff like that. And that's a family member of the farm that we feel like the old man was protecting the place, because he's the one that the next morning that told us to get our stuff and go. Well, this is his great nephew. This would have been his great nephew. Now, granted, both of the nephews weren't very close. It ain't like they spent their entire summers on that farm. It was, they knew him well enough to call and say, "Hey, can I go hunting?" So, yeah.
Well, and something else about your second incident I remember you saying is that it was fine in the morning. It felt light, airy, no problems. I think I might be putting words in your mouth for this, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but even normal animal sounds were out there at the time. But the later in the day that it just got heavy, and it just had that really creepy feeling like you weren't supposed to be there, even though you had permission from the human beings to be there.
Right. It was just it was a depression that almost that you would feel like it come over the place. All in all, Dwight and I talked about the animals that we had taken off the farm, the deer. And truthfully, for a place that hadn't been hunted, we really didn't have a lot of success. We didn't see the quantity of deer that you should see on a place. And we were talking about, both of us have predator hunted. We predator hunted all over these WMAs that are close to us, and another farm that we have permission to hunt. We never heard a coyote out there on that farm. Never. And Dwight told me that today. He said, we never heard a coyote. Not a coyote, never saw a bobcat, never saw anything else other than a flying predator like a hawk. That's just weird.
Yeah, with that area not having been, I should say, hunted for 30 years, it should have been a veritable zoo out there with everything. Right.
Bobcats are very elusive. You don't see them much in the daylight at all, but you see signs. You see rabbit fur, and you'll see coyote droppings, and they'll have fur in it. We never saw any of that. And he told me that's when he was suspicious of the property. He said it had been a while. It had been a while that he had felt like that something was just wrong there, because the deer had food, water, and all the pine thickets for shelter, and they just weren't there in the numbers that they should have been there.
Something that Pat brought up that I really didn't touch on, going back and listening to his episode as well, I was like kicking myself going, why didn't I have him expand upon that? But, the whole peanut, in the man's voice, that the way that he tried to emulate the way that the human owner would call peanut is horrifying. We've heard that in other stories, that they're wonderful mimickers. They do a lot of mimicry. And for them to be able to articulate words and try to mimic human speech is pretty incredible. And Chuck, I wanted to run that by you. If you had ever come across anybody, in the archives of your mind, just saying, I heard this weird, it sounded like someone with, and, no offense, but it's just one of the ways that someone might say it sounds like a deaf person or someone with, Down syndrome trying to speak. Is there anything in your mind that, would be jogged with that whole peanut incident, with it actually speaking outside the walls?
One time in my life, I heard something, and it was on Elkins Creek. Where Elkins Creek crosses 74, we used to run limb hooks there when I was a kid. We knew everybody out there. And if you weren't family, you were friends enough, close enough to go to Sunday dinner if you wanted to, So one night, two high school friends were with me. We were wading the creek. It was summertime, and we were setting limb hooks. And limb hooks, if you don't know, is for catching catfish. We were wading north in the creek, and we had gotten to the place where we were gonna basically camp for the night. And we had set our hooks up and down the creek from our location. I mean, I was a teenager, but we were drinking beer and doing stupid teenager stuff. And well, we went south in the creek, and we're getting a few fish off the hooks and put them in our basket. And on our way back up, we stopped and ate. We figured it hadn't been enough time. Well, we were going up. One of my friends stopped me and said, "Hey, man, did you hear that?" And we hear something say, hey, twice. And that was it. And, it was I mean, it was a human voice, but we got flashlights. We never see anything. So we got out of there. We figured, I kind of blew it off as my stepdad knew we were drinking and probably just wanted to run us off.
I mean, did it sound weird or creepy or abnormal?
It was not a, like, if I say, hey, or hey, it was different. It was a more raspy sound with more effort being put into trying to say it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That in that time, I would have never attributed that to anything else other than when I heard James Pat's talking about Peanut. That's the first I'd ever heard of anything trying to mimic. What if, I don't know. That could have very well been, but that's my only experience with anything like that. And I had never heard anything about mimicry until I heard Pat's. Like I said, because I don't research this stuff. I'm just telling what happened to me.
Now, Pat, as far as Peanut goes, and I didn't touch on this, so I kind of wanted to really quickly, if you don't mind. With those, there was 2 dogs there, right? And one of them obviously is named Peanut, but then they both ended up going missing. Was that at the same time or at different points in time?
There's different points in time. Peanut, to my knowledge, stayed on after this. He was a little house dog. There had been reportedly, and I never got the straight of 2 or 3 larger dogs who had been there, but they were missing. You could see the evidence of where he had them in the yard, but by the time that I was involved in this, they were gone. And he mentioned kind of in a loose way that they've gone missing, or he didn't know what had happened, or it just depended on his mood. A couple of times he spoke about it, whether or not he blamed somebody for their absence or not. So I never found any evidence of the larger dogs, but there had been, and they were gone. Now, Peanut, on the other hand, reacted, he'd wet himself all under the bed or under furniture in the house and that sort of stuff, reportedly, at least what I was told, when this thing would come around. So,
that speech, I mean, talk about not sleeping. You hear something like that on the other side of the wall, and it sure as heck fire in you calling Peanut in the middle of the night. I mean, it's just, no, that's a big old bag of nope right there for me. That would really creep me out.
Yeah. Well, even so, as when we were kids, we weren't allowed to have a dog. My stepdad wouldn't. He said they won't stay around anyways. They don't. He's had dogs, and they never lived to be old age. The only dog that was had on the farm was an indoor small dog. That dog lived ripe old age and died of old age, but there was never an outside dog for us to be had. We didn't have them.
I mean, looking back, do you think that that's kind of odd, or is that just kind of the way it is because of the fact there's so many things to chase and they run off?
Well, we're talking, this is on the edge of that community that doesn't, it's like Appalachia. There's secret, there's these people are so secretive. And I wasn't born in that community, so I was still kind of an outsider. And my mom married into the family out there, and so I feel like there was a lot of information that we weren't privy to. But our family across the road, they didn't have dogs. I remember they didn't have dogs. I mean, it was all my stepfather's cousins and all that lived along the road. I mean, it was, the whole road was his family. And on the property, there was a small creek that fed Elkins Creek. It's all right there on that corridor. Well, that same creek was a tributary from Elkins Creek to the Flint River, which is right on the other side of the hill. And that tributary went all the way around that hill into the Flint River. So it's highly possible. I hate to even speculate, but it was nothing. We'd have cows just show up dead. And we had the bone pile and the chicken pits, and it was nothing to go out there, after school in the afternoon when you go get your dead chickens out of the chicken house and ride back there to throw them in the pit, and the tops be flipped off, not blown off, they'd be flipped open, and I would get chewed out because I, quote unquote, left them open, and I didn't leave them open. So, but I never saw footprints. I didn't pay attention to that stuff. I was a kid.
Pat, something and I think that you're going to be the perfect person to run this by, and then I definitely want to get to some of the other subjects that are on these sheets here. As far as them being paranormal, whether it be the Bigfoot and the Dogman, either or, whatever. And this is, of course, got two sides to it, which make it equally confounding and interesting, possibly. But, if they're paranormal, I guess why wouldn't they appear on each and every continent in the world? Why wouldn't they just pop into maybe, say, Antarctica and just grab a penguin? Or, Iceland and I don't know why I'm going for birds. I love birds. I have pet birds and I'm going for all these birds, but go to Iceland and grab a puffin out of the air and then poof, back and they're gone, only leaving behind the ozone smell, right? Of course, the other side of that is there has to be a person there to either A, see it, or B, see the evidence left behind by said creature. As you said, they are physical when they're here. But that doesn't really negate the fact that, occasionally there are people in places like Antarctica or something like that. So, why wouldn't there be this errant footprint left behind, or this, someone actually to see something like that happen? I guess, why, if they're paranormal, why aren't they seen in basically each and every place? Why would they be so hell-bent on getting to a place like the Flint River? And there are obvious reasons. They like to stay hidden. There's food and water. They need that while they're here. But it just does seem like they would have all these other options to go all these other places.
Well, I mean, in opinion, and this is what I offer, is their interactions are with us. And for whatever reason, they are around us in places where we are. And when I say us, I mean Homo sapiens, human beings. Now, why is this? Why does this interaction take place? Your guess is as good as mine. I do know, though, that, for instance, if you look across the world, every place where you have human habitation, you have these legends, or you have these stories, or these encounter incidents where people have encountered these creatures. You got me on, Antarctica. Never heard anything from there. Although the different, I leap back to the idea of the cosmic jokers, which is to say that these things appear as we want to perceive them to appear. Right now, in our conscience, there are television commercials about Bigfoot. My name's not Bigfoot, my name's Daryl. It's part of our consciousness in the United States. And, in the Native Americans culture, it was the same sort of encounter that this large, hairy, ape-like creature, this is how they described them to the first Europeans who arrived on the continent. If you look at the descriptions of, say, for instance, the Almasty in Siberia or the Yeti, they take on the physical characteristics of the animals or the apes or the things that are indigenous in the area. The one exception that is really interesting to me is the Yowie in Australia, which there's no fossil evidence for this creature to exist in Australia yet, because you have this inclusion into the mind and lore of the people who have since, the Europeans who have since moved to Australia, and the Aborigines. suddenly we have this sort of idea, this thing. Now, I don't know how to express the notion that we have these in our world, and they seemingly can come at will. And of course, this is all conjecture on my part, but it seems that in absence of us, there is really no fossil record. And I know people, they've trotted for the Gigantopithecus black eye theory. Okay, but they're basing this entire theory off of, a couple of 3 jawbones from China. But if you go to Tibet, which is adjacent to China, or Nepal, or those areas, they have full-on religious texts that describe these creatures in much the same way that we perceive them to be here on this continent, in our perception coming from the Native American perception of what these creatures are. Every place you go to, and it's interesting that you mentioned Iceland, because I was thinking about that, because, in Ireland and Iceland, they have things called fairy forts. And it is common for people to report seeing little people living in and around these fairy forts. And that would seem, well, that's just folklore. Well, but, Iceland's some, 600-800 miles across the North Atlantic, completely different sort of European culture from the Celtic Irish culture. And yet they have these same manifestations happening around these circles of trees or rocks. And if you were to go out to New Mexico, the Navajo people and the Hopi people have legends of little people in much the same way that the people in Ireland and Iceland do. So I think it has a lot to do with their interaction with us and how we perceive them to be. Now, I could be completely wrong and say, well, maybe there is a tribe of, these creatures living amongst us in the 21st century. But I think that someone else would have, achieved some sort of tangible evidence by this point. There's something at least beyond footprints or, they say hair samples. But the interesting thing about the hair samples that I've seen or read about is they have human female mitochondria DNA, but they can't identify the other side of the DNA, at least on the couple of reports I've read about these. So what are we dealing with? I don't know. Now, I'm going to go around the mulberry bush in this explanation a little bit, but I'm going to talk about the area in general where Chuck's talking about. There is a geological formation called the Cove Dome. And in and of itself, if you were just to encounter it, there's one road in, one road out. And it appears to be just a valley or a bowl inside a ring of small mountains, which is what the Pine Mountains are composed of. The floor of the actual bowl itself is approximately 4.2 square miles. But what geologists have discovered, or they believe to have be the origin of this phenomena, or this geological anomaly, is that it was in fact a meteor impact crater. And the interesting thing is the rim at the top of this bowl is quartzite, but the bottom is metamorphic in nature. It's schist, another metamorphic rock. And even to this day, and this is the thing people don't get, or throws them, is they had to put special cell towers inside of this because the electromagnetic interference is such that you couldn't do a tower into the area itself. You couldn't get a cell phone signal. And we're going back to the 80s and the early 90s, and I did not know at the time. I've gone through that area before. Once upon a time, in the center of it, there were two big radio telemetry dishes pointed up at the sky. And the fence outside said it was AT&T. Well, later on in research, I found out that, in fact, those were part of something called Project Phoenix, which was in turn part of the SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence project, that was very prevalent. You know, they conducted it probably from the 80s into the late 90s. And those two dishes were sitting in this particular spot, strangely enough, in this backwoods sort of Georgia County, looking for signals from outer space for intelligent life. And, you know, I've always wondered, and since that time, I've wondered, you know, exactly what are we dealing with in this area, because the area itself causes electromagnetic interference, at least according to the anecdotal information and evidence that I've researched and found. And seemingly over on the coast of South North Carolina and Georgia, there's a phenomenon called Carolina bays. And all of these bays have a shape that is kind of like a half moon or a boomerang. And geologists have theorized that these were the result of meteor impacts that probably along the same time frame. Now, did a meteor hit there sometime in remote history, and then fragments fly off and land over on the coast of the Carolinas in the Georgia coast? Can't say, don't know, but I do know that from the flora and fauna and the plants that have sprung up along the Carolina Bay, it's one of the few places on the planet where you have an indigenous carnivorous plant population. Venus flytraps, those hooded jar trap, sort of plants that just don't exist in other places. And back in the 90s, back in the early part, around the time frame, this is all happening concurrently, although I wasn't aware of it, is Elkins Creek and the other things that took place. There was a place called the Pine Mountain, LaGrange, Columbus corridor where they were having all sorts of UFO activity, and these things are flying around over there, which is a little bit further southwest from where we are in that area. And, all of these sorts of weird things are taking place during that time frame. I know Chuck touched on cattle mutilations or mutilations of animals earlier, and I remember, although I didn't investigate it myself, that there was, in an adjacent county, some, I believe there were calves mutilated in a couple of incidents of, like, he was talking about people's cows coming up mutilated, but them finding the carcass and just not being able to explain in necropsy, what happened. Did a predator do this or whatever? So, I don't know. Is it the ground itself? Okay, because I'm saying this because if once upon a time, I don't even know if it's still existent in light of all of the stuff that's happened with the Boy Scouts of America, but across the river from the Cove Dome was Camp Thunder. And it was a Boy Scouts of America camp, and it was fairly large, a lot of land, and it in turn had been at one time holy ground, medicine ground for the Creek Nation. And part of the legend, or why they call it Camp Thunder, is that periodically there would be thundering from the ground beneath the camp itself. And there's just been all sorts of Native American evidence. I mean, this place, a friend of mine who's passed on now, but he made a habit. He would go to a few select streams and areas and would collect like arrowheads and stuff. But he actually, in the area itself, found Clovis points, which anybody who's familiar with, the near ancient history of the United States, Clovis Point, we're going back to the end of the last ice age when the first people had arrived in the area. So the area had been inhabited at least 8,000 to 10,000 years before our present time. And, it just amazes me, all of the stuff that continues on. It's generational, although it's hard to get people to talk about it. Like Chuck was talking about, people are closed mouthed. They don't want to talk about it. And the area itself seemingly has something going on with it. Now, I went around the mountain to go back to what you're talking about. Well, we perceive these creatures through the social constructs or the things that we're taught to perceive them by. You know, I didn't believe in it, but I knew what a Bigfoot was in the 70s because I had seen the Patterson-Gimlin film. Back in those days, they had a couple of television shows, one with Leonard Nimoy, and then they also had occasionally documentaries would actually be shown in this. So see this stuff, and it was good for a fright, but you didn't take it serious, or at least I didn't take it serious. So in my mind, I had an idea of what these things should look like. And I think that most people become aware of what these things should look like from our popular society, popular culture. Well, this is Bigfoot. This is what Bigfoot looks like. But this is an enculturation that we have. It's like, Chuck mentioned earlier, he was talking about the Bible. Well, Bigfoot's not in the Bible, so Bigfoot doesn't exist. Well, Bigfoot is in the Bible. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, in Genesis, he said there were giants in those days. You can research in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. You talk about, there were giants. And that whole chapter or an area in that chapter, these creatures in the book of Enoch, let me just spring forward. It's an apocryphal book, but it describes how angels fell and mated with human women and created a race called the Nephilim. Now, I'm not saying Bigfoot's a Nephilim, but I'm saying that from a purely sort of, this is not new phenomena, is what I'm saying. I'm saying that every society, every culture, from the Sumerians, the Assyrians, the Indo-European, the Chinese, everybody has these stories about the existence of these creatures. So what does this mean in total? Well, I don't know what it means, except for the fact that I think they've always been here. And maybe we're the new kid on the block in this particular case. And maybe these things have been manifesting and going about their business this entire time. And maybe we're just encountering them. And because of our science and technology advancing, we're finally starting to be able to perceive them as other than a boogeyman or a fairy tale or something that just goes bump in the night, although we still have those feelings. But maybe we're encountering something that is part of this planet, if that makes sense. I don't know.
You brought up the cat of mutilations again, and something that I wanted to ask you, Chuck, about before I got off on the paranormal side of things. What were the details on the injuries of those dead cattle that you mentioned?
On our farm?
Yes.
I don't remember any specific thing that was odd. I just, other than it would happen at the most inopportune time. We'd have to go deal with a dead cow, and a lot of times the injuries would just be attributed to coyotes because we had coyotes and foxes. We were overrun with them, but nothing out of the ordinary.
Nothing too weird there. Okay.
Nothing too weird on our farm.
Right. So, kind of in closing here, if you guys are okay with it, Chuck, you brought it up in your episode, is the story of Emily Birch. And, I think especially for your purposes, I think the tie-in here is just pretty interesting and remarkable. So if you wanted to run through that, and then we can discuss that a little bit, because this is quite the fascinating story, and it's right in you guys' area.
First, I kind of wanted to say, I do know a little bit about Native American folklore. Happen to have just a tiny bit of the blood, and the Creek Indians had a mythological creature in their beliefs called the Kaula or Kaloa, which they believed it was a large, hairy man-eating ogre. And it translated to ape or gorilla. And then there was a I can't remember the name of it, that there was another one that they believed would steal a man's soul upon his death, or right as a man was dying. And I can't remember what it was called, but the one about the hairy man-eating ogre, these things are based somewhere. It's like we talked about in my episode about Dracula. Dracula was based off Vlad the Impaler. So these things have a factual basis. So there's bound to be something we don't know about.
Mm-hmm.
But speaking about Emily Birch, all right. So in all of our efforts to earn our keep on the farm where my incident occurred at, to be able to hunt the property, Dwight and our other friend was doing work around the farm. And he had no idea who this was. He brought it up. He said, man, when we were talking yesterday and today, he said that the family had carved their names in the barn beside the house. He said, it's the original barn. And he said there was a couple of names, and that obviously, he said, the old man was named after this man, and because the date was just too far off to be, he said the date went back to the early 1800s. Well, one of those names carved on it, he said, I swear I want to say it was Emily Burt. He said, I remember, he said, you could see the date. He said it was 1862. She carved her name on the wall on the inside of the barn. I asked him, I said, do you know who that is? He said, I haven't got a clue. He said, don't know how she's related and don't know. He said, but there was a couple of that same name. There was a couple of people's names in different years. He said there was another Bert, but when he said Emmy Burt, that really stuck to me, because that's the girl in the tale of the werewolf girl of Talbot County. And I've said it in the past that it could be a tie-in, because it is so close to where all of that originally happened. And it was just so freakish that he brought her up. When I told him that, he looked it up, and he said, I had no idea that there was anything like that. He's not a quote unquote believer whatsoever. He thinks we can go down there and kill it. If we can get back in, we can go down there and kill it. Every time I've talked to him, that's what, we'll go kill it.
Well, yeah, and Pat, you also glamped onto this idea of, the Emily Birch story and what was going on with that. And you already brought this up before, but you said you found strange footprints that you couldn't really classify as the classic Bigfoot track, right? So what are some other things that you've found out in relation to the Emily Birch story?
Well, just basic research. I knew of the story that she goes to boarding school in Paris. She's changed. She's sickly. She's inattentive. She starts wanting to take walks late at night. And then, on the heels of this behavior at home, they start having local farmers. They're losing sheep. They're losing cattle, whatever. And a local guy who had immigrated apparently from Eastern Europe said, no, this isn't a wild dog. You've got a werewolf on your hands. So the story goes, he told them, you've got to melt silver, make it into bullets, and to hunt and prevent it. Well, they hop a creature out there, a wolf-like creature. One of the farmers shoots it, and the mother discovers her back at home, been shot in the arm. And then it just goes quiet. I mean, apparently, although the story in the account I heard, she was shipped back to Europe, but to Switzerland to some sort of specialist. and she stays there for another year or two. Then she comes back and everything's copacetic after that. And she lived to a ripe old age right there in Talbotton, down in Talbot County. I think probably, that's what it said. It said she died in June 1911 on the 18th, and she was 69 and was considered a well-respected member of the community. And her grave is, you can visit the grave. It's at the Owens Cemetery. But of course, you read it and they say, well, this is a fable. This is fabricated. That's what the general thought is. But, it just is pretty odd that they would pick this one particular instance in this really obscure, I mean, no offense to people in Talbot County, but at the time frame, it's a backwater in terms of why didn't this happen in London, or why didn't this happen in New York or someplace, but this happens, off in this rural area down in South Georgia, almost South Georgia. I don't know. There's so much that's being questioned. In society, period, right now. It's, they keep on the internet. If you read a little bit, people are talking about a great awakening, but I don't think it's just political. I think there's an awakening happening in many different venues spiritually. I think people open it up. I mean, like I said, I've seen it build. I've been researching this. It seems that the incidents are growing larger and more intense as time goes by. And so why? The footprints I saw, they're only explainable in a real logical sense that if a large dog, and when I say large, I mean something like a Great Dane sized dog, was sitting on his haunches on that muddy bank on the side of the Flint River. And that's basically it. I mean, I would tell anyone listening, that's what I accounted for it. I said, I don't know why he was a pretty big old dog. I hope I don't encounter him out here, because he'd be a handful. But I saw the footprints, but until I heard Chuck's story and what he was talking about, I never really attributed it to anything potentially other than being a large dog. So who knows especially if you consider the paranormal aspect of this, who knows what's winking in and out or walking around in these still sort of remote areas in our state. I know game wardens, they encounter stuff out there. They don't talk about it. Just like, we're on this show, but if say 1996, if you'd asked me, I'd have shook my head and I'd have walked right away. No, I don't know anything about it. Simply out of self-preservation, because that's the way our society is. And if you come up with something that people consider odd, you're fair game. Or if you break outside of some sort of social, framework, and you have a different idea, you've taken your life in a real academic sense. You've taken your life in your own hands as far as science goes. You're out there. He's a clown. Don't listen to anything that person has to say. It doesn't matter whether or not what you have to say is valid. You have an excellent job in that you get to explore this all day, and you get to interview multiple people who've had these sorts of experiences, and it's part of your job description. You know what I'm saying? So it's wonderful if someone has a vocation or a job like you do. You can explore this and not suffer any of the consequences socially that a person who has a different kind of job function might suffer if they decide to share what they believe is at least reality. Because how can, is this truth? Are we talking about truth? I believe Chuck's encounters. I know that my encounter, I believe that we're conveying truth in this podcast. I believe that people out there listening will understand that in my view of this, that it's truth as far as I'm concerned, but what is the reality, and can I define it? I can't. And that's what, unfortunately, that's where we're always left with this. We're always left with that. It's like, well, I know this happened. I'll stand by what I say, but I can't prove, I mean, I have the cast, but I still just leave a doubt there's always a little specter of doubt in the back of a person's mind as to, did this really happen to me? Is this really, and that's just, I don't know. That's where you just have to kind of leave it and research and go on and try to understand.
Pat, it's funny you bring up the self-preservation and the jobs and things. And I actually do still have a normal job on top of doing this. And the funny thing about it is, though, is that my nickname at work, and this is prior to them finding out that I'm just this little weirdo and I do this show and I'm into Bigfoot and all this other stuff. My nickname at work was Shannibal. Like Hannibal Lecter, but it's Shannibal. So I guess they trapped me there. They could see right through me even before they knew what I was up to for many a years, actually, before it kind of came out at work. But it's just funny that you mentioned that. Chuck, any closing thoughts on what Pat was saying or anything?
I agree with what he's saying. Real, and honestly, I don't care who, if you believe me or not. All I ask is that hear me out and make your own assumption. I don't want to be overly critical, but I've gotten it's just a campfire story type of deal comment here and there from a couple of folks that figured me out who I am. With all that, I can laugh with them, and in the end, I say, I wish it was a campfire story.
Right, especially when we end up unloading a weapon at something, which you said that was a huge deal to you to be that terrified, knowing that, hey, this is something that I feel like I'm in mortal danger. It's time to unload my weapon.
Right, and it's like I said before, there's not a whole lot out there that scares me. It took a lot to scare me to that point, but even Pat can agree. In the field that we were both in, there are things that happen that you can't explain. Even I've just seen some weird things that as a law enforcement officer you can't explain, and it'll get intertwined in your psyche, I guess, that'll bother you for years. For something like this to happen to me, when all I was doing was enjoying a recreational sport that I've enjoyed since I was a boy, and I gave no reason to cause anything or anybody any harm, that scared me. There was something out there bigger than badder than I was. And that's always the case, in life. There's always somebody bigger and badder, but we're supposed to be the top of the food chain. And at that moment, in that moment in my life, I was not the top of the food chain, I feel like.
Well, Pat, would you please let everybody know, of course, where to find your book, Elkins Creek?
Sure. Basically, any major online bookseller, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Rakuten Kobo. Yeah, like I said, and I again, if you buy the book, I'm gratified. But if you can get it for free at the library somewhere, I'm just as gratified. So there you go.
By the way, I kept, of course, the one that you signed to me, but I sent the other 2 signed copies to a couple of my Patreons, and they were just tickled pink. So thank you so much for sending those extra copies. That really made their day. And of course, Chuck, we're not going to be plugging you because you fly into the radar and that's where you're going to stay. So we're not going to be plugging any websites or email addresses for you, right? Good, sir.
That's right. I appreciate it.
Well, and isn't that the funny thing, though? Because it was you and I that were talking about Pat because you brought him up. And then Pat, we were both looking for you. You already knew I was, but even Chuck was in on it. We were both trying to hunt you down. And lo and behold, it was good old Kyle Filson that came through. But that's the irony of the whole thing is that I found Chuck, but we couldn't find you. And Chuck's flying under the radar. So it's really just quite the fortuitous whole situation, really, with both you guys. And as I joked before we started recording, I now have a Flint River posse. It's awesome.
We were up late one night, weren't we, Shannon? I was like,
yep,
I can find this guy. I know people. I can find him. And I could not find you, Pat.
Well, and that also, like you, I keep a low profile. I'm really not into this for any kind of fame or fortune or anything. And I completely agree with some of the stuff you said off of pre-interview. I'm interested in this for people who have dealt with this, like you have or Shannon has, and just to share the experience and talk about and spitball. And, I just want to remain kind of like you are. I might be flying a little higher on the radar, but I'm not.
Not much.
Not much.
Not much. I'm like, I have an actual law enforcement officer helping me find another one, and we can't find him. He is really it's great. No,
yeah, we were messaging back and forth. And she said, "You're good." I said, "Well, apparently not good enough. We can't find him."
Yeah, it was quite the hunt. But I think it all worked out the way it was supposed to. I mean, like I said, it was just the craziest thing how it all worked out. And then to have really two fantastic guests end up being essentially in proximity, really, this day and age, you're in proximity to each other is just wonderful. And I can't thank you guys enough for all the time that you put in with me. And honestly, I really hope that we do this again.
I enjoyed it. I really did.
Yes.
It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And Pat, it's a pleasure to meet you, sir. And you know who I am. We can find each other. It'd be good to meet you face to face at some point.
All right. And it's nice to have met you. And I thank you, Shannon, for having invited me to participate in this. It was a lot of fun. And I hope that we've informed people and I hope it does some good somehow.
No, I was just going to say, your last book that I got from you, I've really enjoyed that. And I look forward to your future. I think you said you were working on another.
Yeah, Bigfoot too, just compiling stories for it still. So, yeah, working on that with Jeff.
Yep, good. I'm looking forward to that also. Kind of trying to plug you a little bit.
Well, yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. Half the time I forget to mention my own stuff. So, yeah, no, thank you so much. All right, gentlemen. Good evening to my Flint River posse. Hopefully I'll talk to you guys soon.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye, guys.
Well, I'm so-and-so. I was given this name by my parents. I've been to such and such a college. I've done these things in my profession. I produce a little biography. Buddha says, forget it. That's not true. That's some story. That's all gone. That's all past. I want to see the real you are now. Well, nobody knows who that is. Because we don't know ourselves except through listening to our echoes and consulting our memories. But then there's a real you, and that again leads us back to this question. Who are you? That is the real you. We shall see how they play with this exam by the cohorts to get you to come out of your shell and find out who you really are. They will say, no, we don't believe literally in reincarnation. That after your funeral, you will suddenly become somebody different, living somewhere else. They will say reincarnation means this, that if you sitting here now are really convinced that you're the same person who walked in at the door half an hour ago, you're being reincarnated. If you are liberated, you will understand that you're not. The past doesn't exist. The future doesn't exist. There is only the present. That's the only real you that there is. The Zen master Dogen put it this way. He said, the spring does not become the summer. First there is summer, and then there is spring. When you settle down in the train to read your newspaper and so on, you are not the same person who a little while ago left the platform. If you think you are linking your moments up in a chain. And this is what binds you to the wheel of birth and death. But when you know that every moment in which you are is the only moment, this comes into Zen. A master will say to somebody, get up and walk across the room. And he comes back and he says, where are your footprints? They've gone. So where are you? Who are you? When we are asked who we are, we usually give a kind of recitation of a history.